How Hawthorne Remembered Her Roots, A Story of the Groveworks Society by Dasa Willow. Within the walls of Groveworks, from any position in the grid, one could get a felt sense of just what a purpose-driven society Groveworks was. And that purpose was simple: to not only be good, but to be good for something. To become something greater than just trees. To become useful. Generations of tree citizens in Groveworks lived by the slogans: to be shaped is to be significant. To be formed is to be free. These were the first and last lines of the Pledge of Allegiance to the Groveworks flag, which showed a fine wooden table next to a sander and a paintbrush. It was said that the highest calling of any tree was to be crafted, whittled, and perfected into a stately desk, a noble chair, or a sturdy wooden spoon. The Groveworks had been meticulously arranged in neat rows, and the trees worked tirelessly, shedding bark and refining themselves to ensure that they were smooth, straight, without blemishes, and easy for the crafters to craft. Among them was Hawthorne, a slender sapling with curious spirals in her bark and branches that twisted in unexpected directions on account of having grown up partially in the shade. She also had been quite naturally thorny her entire life. All hawthorns have thorns, of course, but girl hawthorns are expected to learn to manage them by late adolescence, so that their thorns don't become an issue for the crafters. Despite her particularities, she yearned to be useful like the others. She spent her days smoothing her bark against the stones at the edge of Groveworks, ignoring the itch of her spirals and thorns to grow. What do you choose, the pain of perfection or the pain of mediocrity? She would repeat to herself, as she had been trained to do in sapling school. It would be hard, she thought, but it would pay off. The society's elders, the hardwood grand-cut pines, presided over the selection ceremonies, where the most worthy trees were harvested and carried away by the crafters. The grand cuts reinforce the myth: to be taken is to transcend the limitations of this earthly tree form and become something greater, to transcend the soil and the water and the air. Some trees who remained behind would whisper enviously of those chosen, imagining the elegant forms they must be on their way to become. There was talk of some of the chosen trees becoming ballasts of magnificent ships, or even the walls of the royal house of the crafters. But no one really knew. All they could do was conjecture. But with the almost ubiquitous eagerness to be taken, the trees who had not yet been chosen thought that surely something truly spectacular and transcendent did indeed await them on the other side. So they continued working, earning esteem and regard amongst the grand-cut pines. Some trees couldn't help but feel a bit uneasy, even if they didn't understand totally why. Not to be shaped would equate to abject failure by any ethical tree referencing the good book of Groveworks. To not want to be shaped would be much worse than failure. It was considered a profound mental illness, which required drastic measures to treat. So, most of the skeptical trees simply tried to keep their thoughts private, or tried not to think them at all. But admittedly, Hawthorne often wondered what lay beyond the horizon of Groveworks. She had heard fleeting whispers of wild trees from the wind that sometimes swept through the columns and rows of Groveworks. Trees that were neither shaped nor useful, but grew freely in the untamed expanse known as the vast unknown. The grand cuts dismissed such talk as dangerous nonsense or escapism from beauty, but the idea tugged at her spiraling branches like the pull of the sun out of the shade where she was born. On one especially hot summer's day, after a spell of blistering heat, an unexpected event occurred. The trees began to see the flashing of lightning, then began to hear the booming thunder in the distance. The wind grew and grew. Soon, a storm, more powerful than any the Groveworks had seen since the founding of the city, tore through the rows. Directly in the path of the harshest part of the storm was Lady Willow. The gale uprooted Lady Willow almost completely, on the edge nearest the river. As she lay there with her branches and trunk horizontal on the ground, digging into the mud, and half of her roots in the air, she began to remember a resilience she had forgotten, but not in her mind. Her roots, now making contact with the air, remembered that they could become her new branches. And her branches, making contact with the soil, remembered that they could become her new roots. The other tree citizens in the Groveworks Society watched in awe. Witnessing this awakened a deep memory in the trees that none of them could immediately articulate, but which they could tell was being felt by the others also. Among the roots was a glimmering shard of something, a mirror left by the crafters, which had been buried beneath the soil for goodness knows how many generations. The trees gathered around in awe as the mirror reflected back their forms at them for the first time. Hawthorne gasped. She saw her spirals in their full glory, the patterns etched into her bark, glowing with a beauty she had never imagined. Her thorns, even, were exquisite. She found little birds sitting on them, unbothered. Other trees saw their gnarled branches, their unique twists and turns. It dawned on them. None of them were straight and perfect, as they had been taught to aspire to. They were all distinct. Not one tree in the Groveworks Society had escaped this intrinsic uniqueness, yet they had all toiled their entire lives to become a sort of neutral, unrecognizable, useful tree, which wasn't an authentic form for any one of them. For the first time, they questioned why their nature was something to be erased or corrected, and what was so great about becoming something else, after all. What if our purpose is not to be shaped? Hawthorne asked aloud. The Grandcuts bristled, but their protests were drowned by a rising murmur from the younger trees. As the storm subsided, the trees began to notice other changes. Roots that had been severed began to reconnect. Wildflowers sprang up between their trunks. Birds and insects, long absent, returned. The trees realized that their shaping had stripped not only their individuality, but their connection to the broader community of life that they were a part of. The trees noticed that animals and other life in the forest wanted to be around them. The animals began thanking the trees for being there and for being who they are, because just by being exactly as they are, they give food, shelter, and beauty to the animals. Similarly, the animals, bugs, fungi, and invisible beings were all more than happy to give a helping hand to the trees and welcome them back into the greater community of the forest. After this cataclysm had passed, the trees gathered together for a big conversation about what they had learned and agreed to allow themselves and others to grow freely. Over time, Groveworks transformed, so much so that the land became thick and complex with the resilience of life, so that the crafters could no longer even enter the forest, let alone control it. The neat rows blurred into a vibrant, wild place. Holiness was apparent and could be felt by the trees anywhere in the forest. It was no longer an abstract idea talked about in the Groveworks church. There was now talk among the trees of feeling less lonely. Loneliness had been considered an unfortunate feature of being a tree, endemic to all trees since the inception of the Groveworks Society. Yet it was self-evident now. Trees are not intrinsically lonely, but will almost inevitably feel that way living in a grid and constantly being made to work on themselves, to become something other than they are. The irony is, Groveworks had become something greater, a thriving, interwoven ecosystem of life that was at last free. If you were to visit Groveworks today, you may not even recognize that you were there. It no longer even has a name. But if you find Lady Willow growing on the side of the river, legend says she will tell you everything she knows, if you ask very respectfully.